There we go. And I'll just share my screen. Everyone can see it. I can't see you, so if somebody can say that it's okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay,
Right.
fantastic. So welcome to this webinar today. My name is Nicole. I'm the International Coordinator of Education at the Foundation for Environmental Education, with a responsibility for our Learning About Forests program. Learning About Forests operates under the Foundation for Environmental Education in 26 countries globally, and it's our flagship outdoor education program. Today, as part of the Forest Series webinars, we're having a film screening and a discussion on how goats can regenerate our forests. And together with us today, we have Patrick Jones, a community forester, who will be facilitating the discussion. Just some guidelines about the webinar. You will be muted during the presentation to prevent any interruption. So please don't unmute yourself while we're doing the film screening. But then there will be a discussion later. So of course, you're welcome to type in questions in the chat. And during the discussion session, you would also be able to unmute yourselves and participate. If you want a certificate of participation, you can write your name and email as a private message to Saga. So you can find Saga in the participants list and send your name, and we will send you a diploma afterwards. As I said, we're recording the webinar, so it will be later uploaded on our website and on the YouTube channel of YRE International. A little bit about our speaker before I leave the floor to him. So Patrick is part of the neo-peasant collective Artist as Family. He's a community forester, a permaculture teacher, a poet, a forager, a father, a gardener, and a degrowth economy activist. He lives in Aboriginal land and helps regenerate the forest using goats. But he can tell you a little bit more about this because there's a lot of interesting things here. So I'll just stop sharing my screen and leave it up to Patrick.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Nicole. And thank you for having me speak tonight. Well, it's tonight here, I should say. And wherever you are in the world, I hope you are well nourished and fed, and you have birdsong not far from you. I'm listening to the corellas putting themselves to bed out my window as I speak. Yeah, so I, well, before I introduce myself, I thought I'd just acknowledge that I am speaking from Jara People's Country, Dja Dja Wurrung's spoken for country. Dja Dja Wurrung people have been living and holding ceremony and ritual on this country for at least 40, maybe 50,000 years, and are continuing to hold ceremony and rituals of renewal on this land. And it is Jara spirit and Dja Dja Wurrung economy and culture that I have personally drawn a lot of my inspiration for working as a permaculture teacher, and also as a regenerator of forests and of of course I guess a holistic economic activist, I suppose, is another clunky label for what I do. I have a number of degrees in the arts. I have a doctorate in the ecological humanities as a poet, looking specifically at language, language around poetic language around what we're facing in terms of climate and species decline, and basically ecological crises across the world. But what I'm specifically interested in is what is working in the neighborhood sphere. So working with neighbors and very close community kin to walk the talk of ecological renewal and ecological culture and ecological economy. So I'm going to, at the end of the talk, post some links about what Artists' Family do. That's the collective that I work mostly from, but I guess I'm a collaborator in many, many different forms. Some of those include men's circles or fire circles or grief rituals, local government, democratic renewal in local government. I'm on a group called Community Voice here in Daylesford. And Daylesford is just about an hour and a half by car north of Melbourne. That's a sulphur-crested cockatoo going over. And by foot, I think it's taken me about 3 days to walk to Melbourne from here to present papers on climate change and other things such as that. So we here live without a car. I call ourselves neo-peasants because we are really reclaiming our ancestral connection to land, even though our ancestors are from mainly Europe and the Middle East. And when I say we, I'm talking about my household, of my partner Meg and my two boys Zephyr and Blackwood, and our little Jack Russell Zero, and many volunteers that come and live and learn permaculture and neo-peasant lifeways and economy here on Jarrah country. So tonight we're going to start by looking at watching a 12-minute film that Jordan Osmond made from Happen Films, and that will kind of give a little bit of insight into the type of forest that's just on which is about a 2-minute walk behind me. We're right on the edge of suburbia in a town of 3,000 people, and we are surrounded by forests, and in the winter they are wet, luscious forests full of water, and in summer, in this Australian the sun in Australia is incredibly harsh, and as soon as the summer kicks in, that forest becomes tinder and very flammable. So I'd like to talk to you about goats as fire mitigation and also as ecological weeders and renewers of country. So I think, Nicole, if we could go to the film now and then come back, and I'll say a few more words, but I really would like to find out more about who is in this webinar so I can tailor my talk a bit more critically. So if throughout the film you want to just say something about if you're involved in goats, if you're a student of environmental studies, if you're interested in, where your interests are, just a sentence or so I can look through those and tailor my talk a bit more accordingly. Do you have any experience with animals? Do you have experience with goats? Yes, so please feel free to give me a little bit of material, and then I can speak specifically to certain things. Okay, thanks.
Fantastic. So I'll be sharing the screen. If for some reason you can't see it or the image is distorted, you're also welcome to watch it by yourselves on YouTube. But I'm sending the link now, and I will be sharing my screen right away. Can you confirm that you can see it?
Yes.
Great. And that you can hear it?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yes. Really what we're trying to do is to transition weedy forests into grassy woodlands. And once the grassy woodlands return, wallabies and kangaroos can come into the forest and start maintaining it. With goats and hand tools, you can actually help move the forest. What would ordinarily might take 20 years or 100 years, you can speed that up so that things repair much more quickly. The plant life of the forest floor returns.
Walking one patch of forest, barefoot. I hear the earth and sense myself as it. My wide field, brightly straight.
The problem with land management as it applies to blackberries is this sort of mentality of correct and incorrect, good and bad, good and evil. In that sort of classic permacultural principle or permacultural understanding that the problem is the solution, rather than seeing blackberries as the enemy, understanding blackberries as the nurse plant, their habitat, their soil builders, their soil stabilizers, but understanding that its dominance is disabling biodiversity because it's covering the entire forest.
The blackberries are just so smothering here. You can't access these areas at all, not even going for a bushwalk, unless you want to get cut up by blackberries.
They pose a huge fire risk when they're 2 and 4 metres high. Each year the canes die back and then the new leaves and canes grow on top, and so they just keep amassing each year. And what's left in the middle is basically tinder ready to fuel fire. So if embers from a fire get into them, they can rush up, and the blackberries often grow up trees so they can fuel crown fires because they're making the fire go up, right up into the eucalypts.
The normal methods that I'm aware of in clearing noxious weeds, blackberries and gorse, herbicides, using sprays, using heavy machinery, earth moving machinery, and burn-offs.
The Country Fire Authority, otherwise known as the CFA, about 7 years ago did a big burn through this forest. This is necessary work in terms of protecting the town, but from an ecologist perspective, I kind of reeled back after seeing that work.
It burns off the natives, and it's like if you're stripping the undergrowth, so the only thing that's really going to take off on the next growth is the noxious weeds.
A lot of the hawthorns were burnt severely, and many of the hawthorns have ringtail possum drays built in them. Over the next 2 or 3 years, the blackberry and gorse came back with a vengeance because fire often puts the weed cycle back at stage 1. Watching the takeover of blackberries and gorse come back and thinking there's got to be another way of doing this so that in another 5 or 6 years the CFA don't come back and burn again. There must be another way of transitioning the forest to a much lower fire risk forest, but without destroying habitat, without destroying the ecology. So originally starting by boarding down the blackberries and chopping and dropping the thicker canes, has transitioned to using goats who do this work so effectively and quietly and gently.
So with managing the goats, we'll first select appropriate sites. Once we find a site, we will start making pathways for the fencing, and we use like a solar electric fencing. Once that's done, which is just the grunt work, that's the hardest part, then we'll come through with the fencing. And then we just kind of let the goats into that cell.
The goats we're using are boar goats or boar crosses. They can pretty much survive on blackberries.
They'll eat the leaves, they love the leaves. They love the fruit when it's fruiting. And if you leave them in there long enough, they'll eat the canes to a degree, you know, especially the soft shoots.
They do like other things. They love hawthorn, holly, broom, gorse, all the prickly things. Our idea is that after 3 or 4 years of goats grazing, with the first year, the first season being quite intensive in order to get these 2 to 4 metre blackberry brambles down onto the ground, then by the next year they'll come back to a certain degree. So an acre might take a month for our herd to completely flatten and put down onto the ground. The next year it might take 10 days, and then the following year a week, and then the following year after that just a few days. The plant life of the forest floor returns. In that diversity there's insect diversity, and with insect diversity small mammals have got much more food, and then with smaller mammals larger predatory birds and owls and raptors. Plant biodiversity equals animal biodiversity.
The support from the neighbourhood is important, firstly, so that they don't dob us into the council. Then we can continue doing what we're doing. And second of all, it's education, really.
The neighbours' involvement in this project is really important because of the social licence that's given this work. Some, I think, were a bit reluctant initially.
Patrick and Brad come and see me to see whether I would mind if they put them out the front of my place. At first I was a little bit sceptical about what they were doing, and I didn't think it was, but it didn't worry me. And when they put him in, I actually got a little bit of a surprise of how good a job and the terrain that the goats can get down. It was probably nearly 2 metres of blackberries. We had no idea that the cliff was there. We had absolutely no idea whatsoever. I've had a business doing environmental grooming for probably 6 or 7 years, partners with my brother. We do work for the CFA, we do work for the local shire, but an area like this isn't something that we'd be able to put our machine into because it's too steep, the terrain's too harsh on it. With what we do as well as with goats, it'd be ideal. The areas we can do along the flats, and you can reach a certain way up the bank, and then the rest of it you can leave for the goats.
We're not doing this covertly. It is guerrilla forest management, but it's we're not doing it in some secretive sense. And in fact, we're making little short films about it. We're telling the community about it. But the thing that I think gives us the most security is that all of the neighbours are on board.
I think it's really important to develop those relationships with your neighbourhood and your community, because you'll get people that will want to be a part of it as well. That's alleviation of workload, responsibility. It's kind of spread, and that's quite a lovely thing, because it's, I mean, for what we're doing here, it is putting back into the community, and it is nice when someone comes along from the community and goes, I want to be a part of it, I want to help.
It's this very simple interrelationship. The goats are happy, you keep providing them land, and we're happy because they're doing work that is transforming the ecology, is moving it into its next phase of succession.
Wellbeing is number one. If the goats aren't happy, you're not happy. Yeah, and they'll make you know it.
This forest has grown me up. It has enabled me to see the importance of wildness in our very domesticated lives. if there is a relationship between wildness and the domesticated aspects of our lives, then I feel like we're going to be people who know how to work with the land again. I'm a second peoples person on First Peoples country, but I have my own First Peoples ancestry to draw on, and we all do. We all come from First Peoples somewhere in the world, and those stories are important because we haven't always been trammelers of land. So this forest has enabled me to have an education of what I would call the living of the world, be a student of the living of the world, and be a participant of the living of the world. And that has given me some hope. Yeah, that has given me some hope. Yeah, and joy. And just to get back to this absolute basics. With all my university education and all the busyness and all the noise of social media and all the noise of our culture, really, this is our way back to sanity. Whatever relationship we can have with this material is not a story of domination.
Here we go. We hope you enjoyed it. And now we'll be opening the floor for questions for Patrick. If you haven't already, you can put in the chat who you are and why you're here and what your relationship is to nature, the environment, or to goats.
Or maybe education, or yeah. While people are thinking, I might just add a few things. We've just finished a spring flora count in that land that you just saw in the video. So that video was taken in winter. And I was pretty cold. It was a frosty morning when that interview took place, and I was shivering just about the whole time. So yes, we've just finished a flora count, and we counted 35 indigenous species that have returned to country in the last 2 years since the goats have been on that land. So prior to that, the great majority of that land was covered in 2 to 4 meter high blackberry. So the first winter, you saw footage from the second winter the goats had been on, and then we take them off through this the spring and summer, so that the recharge can happen. So that while there's probably at least 35 species of grasses and sedges and herbs and small bushes and tree saplings that are coming back that are not indigenous. We haven't done that count yet, but I would imagine there's at least 35 species. We can confirm there are 35 species of indigenous flora that has come back to this part of southern Jarrah Peoples Country. So we're pretty excited about that, and documenting this process as we go is a big part of what we do. And if you want to see the video that documents that ecological recharge, We've just posted that on our Artist as Family YouTube page, so I can post that link a bit later before I go tonight. So 35 species of indigenous flora that was not there mainly because the blackberries had shaded everything out. And so when the blackberries are eaten and the canes are trampled, and this also happens in other parts of Australia, and I've heard other parts of the Northern Hemisphere too, because I've been chatting with people in around the world about this film. And the blackberry, it may be blackberry, it may be some other really dominant species that is covering the earth as a pioneer species. So there's been the reason why the blackberries are there in the first place is that gully system was eradicated of all trees and plants for the pursuit of gold in the 1850s to the 1880s. And at that time, when colonization was taking place, which started in the 1840s in this area, so there was a whole lot of migrants from Europe and Asia that came in search of gold, and a lot of plants came either by chance or through because of cultivation with newcomers, such as my ancestors. So the creek and gully area where the goats are on have just really been covered in blackberries for the last many years. But there has been goat herding and animal when before gas came in to Australia in the 1960s, before refrigeration, before really global affluence. Many local people, non-Indigenous local people, kept goats and house cows and sheep on the margins of town, and that did a lot of controlling of environmental weeds. It also had some ill effects as well, and I guess what we're trying to do is to marry the incredible biological controlling qualities of goats, but at the same time understand the ecology and understand that if we just kept the goats on that land permanently, they would actually send it backwards. So it's knowing when to put the goats on into a forest and when to take them out, when they're going to have be most effective for weeding, and then and how important their absence is, like right now when it's early summer. So this is just all about management and managing a herd. I think that all herds, I think this sort of is a general permaculture principle, or a peasant principle of moving animals, not having them permanently fenced. And there's many ways to do that. We use solar fencing because we simply don't have the culture to have shepherds. We are goat herders, but we check on them maybe 2 or 3 times a day. None of us can afford the time to be with them 24 hours around the clock. So we don't want them wandering off into areas which are either ecologically sensitive or socially sensitive, such as neighbors' rose gardens. So it's really, I guess the electric fencing is a very low-tech way of touching the forest floor very lightly. I just noticed there's something, questions coming in to the chat. So
wanted to
Yeah,
ask a question.
Sorry.
Yeah, just wanted to understand. This blackberry is like a endemic species or an exotic? Because it's a large landmass, so that also depends on it. Like why it has been able to take up so much space and become such a dominant species.
Yeah, so it is an exotic species, and in most parts of Australia, in many parts of Australia, it doesn't do very well because it's just too dry. But we are in a sort of a rare, wetter part of Australia. So, and in many respects, our seasons are a bit like sort of Mediterranean to Central Europe. We get down to maybe -8 in the winter, and that's a really cold day. It's usually just sort of about 0, and then in the summer we get up to 40 degrees Celsius. So we have much more rainfall in this part of Australia than many other places. So blackberries have come from Europe and other parts of the world, I believe, but I think the blackberry species we have here is the European blackberry. Yeah, so they were brought in not long after the gold rush, mainly to plant along roadsides, so travelers to the gold rush would have forageable food. They were incorporated as a practical solution to meeting food insecurity needs in the 1850s to the 1880s. So, so the climate here is just perfect for them. It's warmer than Britain and other parts of Europe where they come from. So they're incredibly tenacious, and they take over in this area great tracts of land, and the leaves themselves are green and fire mitigating, but the fire risk is in the dry canes. So year after year they just keep building up and amassing this very dry tinder underneath. So if embers from a fire attack come across with high winds, the embers drop down underneath the green leaves, and then they just explode. Really explosive. So when the blackberries are kept really down low and even just as a ground cover, not only a whole lot of other plants can start to come up and then shade out the blackberries, but as a low ground cover, they're actually fire mitigating, whereas left to become brambles, they're fire enhancing. So it's just understanding the nature of each of the plants that are, particularly weed species. I think weed species pose a huge fire risk in a climate change era. They're usually the species that will fuel fires, and they're the things to reduce. Whereas what we're trying to do is basically move from weedy forests to grassy woodlands. And the types of grassy woodlands that existed here before colonization were able to be burnt in very sophisticated ecological ways. So Aboriginal people across Australia have extremely sophisticated ways of managing the country with fire. Unfortunately, a lot of that information has been destroyed. And even though traditional burning or Aboriginal burning is coming back to Australia in many parts of the country, and that's a really interesting ecological space to observe and to watch that knowledge renewal. However, unfortunately, because of colonization and the punitive way in which Aboriginal people were treated, a lot of the ecological knowledges that were built up over thousands and thousands of years, it's not fast to put that knowledge back, and what remains, the knowledge that remains is enough for renewal, but it's you know, we also we need to attend to the problems of introduced weed species, but also not, as I said in the film, not from a good and evil perspective. I really believe we have to get beyond the wars against invasive species. Most pioneer species, newcomer species that are dominant, are there for a reason. They're doing soil repair, they're building, like blackberry canes themselves build soil structure. They're an amazing material for humus production, and they break down very quickly, and blackberry canes are full of lignin. And so you'll find that with every weed species, is both a good and bad narrative, depending on where you're coming from, and whether you're human or non-human. So I think, yeah, we have to get away from reductionist and simplistic thinking of good and evil species. The blackberries are here unless we continue to pour thousands and thousands of liters of pesticides onto them, or burnt them in non-traditional ways, or, as Brad said, using bulldozers and excavators to remove them, which is all just a waste of very high carbon energy. Pesticides, what I call cheekily white fella burning techniques, which are pretty reductive burning techniques. They're not nuanced and ecological burning like Indigenous Australians developed. And of course, using big excavators and machines. These are all high carbon modes of management, and the world can't afford to use those forms. So I guess, you know, to recall our kind of a recall for a peasantry, for working, you know, responding to what our ancestors, many of us around the world, come from indigenous or peasant ancestries. And we have stories that can bring us back to those sorts of simple and low carbon responses to the predicaments of our time. So it's a holistic process too, because we have we don't buy any food. We grow all our own food, or trade it or barter it. So the goats, the male goats that we have, a surplus of male goats, become part of our food, which is, and the food that comes from the goats is made from weeds. So we have this high protein product that is walked for, that needs no transportation, no veterinary bills, no industrial inputs whatsoever. And then we have meat about once a week or once every fortnight. So we are mainly a plant-based household, and our neighbors who help us. However, to basically convert woody weeds into some of the most nutritional meat in the world. Goats eat herbs and medicine plants. They don't eat pasture. So they take all that pharmacopoeia of medicine from a huge range of plants, particularly, as I said, there is a lot of blackberries there, but there are also a lot of other plants and herbs and beneficial medicine plants for them. And the indigenous plant, blackwood wattle, for example, is a natural worming, is a natural wormer for goats. So yeah, we're finding out a lot about plants and what they do for the health of not just goats, but ourselves as well. So yeah, we're really trying to, we're not, yeah, when, you know, like, while it might seem like a romantic idea to return to peasantry, and it might seem like a very privileged perspective, we're not collapsing the fact that we are also choosing to be reclaim our peasant ancestry, and there is great privilege in that. So I just want to acknowledge that privilege. And while many people in the world are moving away from their peasant past and moving towards more city and industrial forms of culture and economy. I suppose after 3 or 4 generations of being detached from that, I'm really seeking out my peasant ancestry because I feel like peasant and indigenous cultures and economies are actually can hold the world, can actually hold us in a safe climate place in the ways in which our indigenous and peasant ancestors lived, and some are still living. This is the common sense that we've lost. This is the old common sense that we've lost, and that might be very scary to people because there are big wages around currently, but those big wages do attribute to big carbon inputs and very high carbon lifeways. So yeah, so I'm just
maybe I can help with the questions, Patrick. So Melanie is a previous student of environmental science and now an active learner of different ecological management techniques. She's curious how you were able to get this started, what the beginning of the community interaction was like. That's the first question. Maybe we can take that first.
Thank you.
And yeah, maybe, sorry, connected how neighbors are feeling about it now. So how it started and what it's like right at the moment.
Sure. There is a long history in the last, I guess, 100 or so years in the town of people, as I said, working to reduce fire risk using animals. So, and that when I moved to this area 25 years ago, there was the remnants of that still in existence. So I think David Holmgren, who's one of the co-originators of the permaculture movement, lives in this area and is a friend. And I was, as a young person, seeing what he and Sue, his partner, and the community just down 5 kilometers away had been doing for many, many years. And working in really what is called a commons, and to grow timber trees, to regenerate the forest ecologically for ecological purposes or more than human benefits, and also for food purposes. So, and seeing that work was, well, I guess our work is a kind of social succession and ecological succession on from that work. So our forest is quite different. Our neighborhood is different. We have a different organization, but the seed of it, I guess, came from David and Sue as permaculture pioneers. And thinking about a responsibility beyond our own households, like how do we engage with land that is common? It is not, well, it is owned, I guess, or it is at least ownership in Australia isn't something many Aboriginal people focus on. They talk about more custodial relationships. And there's an amazing Indigenous scholar and philosopher called Tyson Yunkaporta, who is really worth checking out. His book, Sand Talk, is a phenomenal book. And he talks about the need to produce a custodial, that we become a custodial species again. And so I feel like David and Sue's work down in the gully really was the infancy of them becoming custodial species of place and working with neighbors in a shared space. Now, we're doing that here with neighbors. So building relationships, not just with goats and trees and plants and kangaroos and wallabies and everyone that lives in that forest, much more than human, but relationships with neighbors are just critical. It only takes one neighbor to not like what you're doing, and they can ring the authorities and the local council will kick us off. And then friends of ours across town, this has happened to them. So really building relationships with neighbours to give social license for this sort of work in a world of insane bureaucracy. If we did this formally, we have done goat trials formally with the CFA. Now that stands for the Country Fire Authority, and we have partnered with the local council and with the state environmental agency. So we have done a trial, and that report has been published. The problem is, though, is if you look at 100 liters of pesticide, and then you look at the slow process of using goats, it doesn't actually stack up economically. And so unfortunately, councils and government authorities that have a very short budgetary perspective, time frame, aren't looking at, say, what investing in goats over 5 years will actually do to reduce fire risk and enhance ecological biodiversity, which improves water quality, which has all these spin-off effects, which reduces greenhouse emissions. So unfortunately, we're still stuck in this mentality of quick and cheap solutions rather than slow and steady responses to the predicaments of our time. And so we do have time. Time is running out, but we do have time to be more measured in our responses, and also to move past this idea of the solution to the problem and concentrate on dynamic and localized responses to the predicaments of our time. I think that's much more nuanced and more complex and less reductive way to think about things. And also, if we go slow and steady, we can be more experimental. If we go fast and furious, with things like pesticides and bulldozers, we do a lot more damage than we do good. And it may stop the fire cycles for a year or two with those industrial forms of management, but the weed cycles come back with a vengeance. Weeds love rupture. They love disturbed soil. That's why the world is full of weeds and fire prone plants, is because there's so much rupturing, because there's so much development. We need to return to be custodial species in order to turn forests back into wet and lush and moisture retaining and carbon retaining soils. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying neighbors are absolutely essential.
Then I'm going into, thank you, Patrick, for that. I'm going to Sabina's comment. Hi, Sabina. Sabina works for the local government in Bosnia-Herzegovina as an intern for the Department of Ecology. She says that she's finding the solution interesting, that they've also had fires during the summer in Bosnia, but even though they don't have bushes, they still have the problem of access to different kinds of forests. And this kind of, and connected to Melanie's last question, actually, how scalable is the solution and how applicable it is to other contexts?
We're working on a very small scale, but in places like California, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of goats are being used in one of the most fire-prone regions in the world. And as many of us will know, California has really been hit by some serious fire cycle summers in the last several years, getting worse and worse. So goats have been used. There is quite a lot online. There's newspaper articles on a really large scale. And obviously it's got, in parts of the world where it's got really bad, governments and agencies are actually spending money. But I guess our thing is we are in a very fire-prone region here, like most of Australia, but it is the second most fire-prone region in Victoria, according to state agencies. So it's pretty serious. However, while working, it's so great to have advocates in government. We don't currently have any advocates in local government or state government or federal government working behind us. So we're not waiting for them to catch up. But if you are someone working in government and you have a fire area, it's really worth exploring the idea with local goat herders, local families. Maybe in your area there are traditional families who need revitalization of their economy. And maybe tradition. I know I've seen an amazing video of traditional goat herders in India, and there's real social issues there of access to land, and this traditional way of managing land is being enclosed because of modern pressures. So yeah, but the revitalization of peasant approaches to and indigenous approaches to land management is really critical, I think, in this age, and to move where we can beyond the industrial and back into biological responses, and ultimately go to biological responses. They're biological controls that can also create local economies. And they can be non-monetary economies like our small-scale venture is, or they might be quite lucrative, or at least many families can be employed to do this work. So in the monetary or formal economy. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I hope that gives some food for thought.
Yeah, definitely it does. If there's any other questions, please feel free to send them in the chat. We're also closing to the end of this webinar. So any last questions, we'll be happy to receive them. Otherwise, yeah, Daniel?
I want to ask something completely different, if I may, Patrick.
Yes.
Because I haven't met you before. Your work is extremely interesting, and I think that you have you come from a country where there's a large focus on the relationship towards the first people, the Aboriginal communities, and their and the knowledge that has been lost over the years. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot since I've started working in environmental education is this the almost dichotomy approach between the youth and what it is that we need to hear from the youth. In the West, we're all the time saying that we need to listen to the youth. But if when you look at indigenous communities, it's usually or in many cases, it's the elderly that are passing down the information from one generation to the next. And I wanted to ask you about your maybe thoughts about that, or where can the line be connected between what is the Western culture that we have been developing over the last 150 years compared to that. And the other thing that I thought a lot about, because maybe some of the people here are a bit younger than, let's say, than myself, but if I think of my grandparents' generation, there was a lot more sustainability in the way they lived. So even if you're looking 80, 90 years ago in the West, or there were values, or there were things that were very connected to to a logical, sustainable, and that is lost as well. So we're not with that discussion between the generations, even in the West, is lost. So that's my question to you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much. Yes, so your first part, I think that's a really interesting point. I not to say though that I think there are wisdoms throughout the generations. So I really see strongly teenage wisdom as a thing. I see it every day in my life. I have a teenage son. I'm around teenagers. I do rites of passage and initiation work with young men. Yeah, so I totally respect and honor teenage wisdom. But I think what you're saying is very valid, that there is also a well, I mean, I can't speak for teenagers and young people, being middle-aged myself, but I feel you know, I feel there's an element of what I felt when I was a young person, and that is, where is the eldership I can respect? My culture is obsessed with money. My culture locks people away. My culture wages war for its resources. My elders and my politicians fight like very immature people in parliament. And while the last several years or the last 10 years, my partner Meg and I have been really seeking out community elders and reinstating community elders. And these are not necessarily high profile people in our community. These are people who are deeply philosophical, deeply caring, and have done a lot of grief work and looked at the state of the world and held and not shied away from their grief, and through that become very wise people. So I feel your question is really pertinent to, I guess, we can just talk about goats and we can just talk about forests in very sort of mechanistic ways, but this is about behavior change, and this is about reinstating what we've lost when we used to when young people went through rites of passage in order to find their gifts, to beautifully and separate from their parents in order to become fully fledged adults in the village or in another village if they moved, in order to know themselves and to know what gifts they have. We've lost that. We basically as a culture sell a whole lot of shit to younger people, a whole lot of stuff to put in their bodies that are not good for them, a whole lot of stuff that means a whole lot of extracting from the earth. So I feel that there is disconnect. There is not respect for eldership when our eldership is trammeling the earth. So I feel like these things, but that story, if we continue to perpetuate that story, we also continue to perpetuate the trammeling of the earth. So the new story that we and people like Charles Eisenstein and many, many Indigenous thinkers and scholars are talking about is that let's not stay in the sickness of the old story, of the story of separation, the story of separation between teenagers and elderly folk. Let's actually start to rebuild teenage initiation, mentorship, and then eldership while we're also renewing forests, because it's the same work. We're renewing ourselves, we're renewing our culture in order to move beyond the story of separation. And the story of separation is the story of climate change, of species collapse, of all those things that we're facing. So so Charles Eisenstein is an incredible thinker in this space, but there are many, many others. Another fantastic person in this to look up is Francis Weller, and he wrote a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and that really goes into the heart, I think, of what you're asking about generational grief, really, because I think it all gets down to grief. Our separation from one another and respect for eldership is, and even and older folk not respecting teenage wisdom or not even understanding that that's a thing. is because we're all separated from one another. So that was spending a lot of time on your first part of your question. I'm not sure if I touched on your second part, but
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel, for the question. Thank you, Patrick, for your wonderful answers. I think we've had some really great questions coming in, and thank you very much for elaborating on your answers. I think we can close the meeting. Just reminding everyone that the webinar will be available online if you want to go back. The links to the video will also be available. Yeah, so have a nice day wherever you are, or have a nice rest of the week.
Or a good night.
Yeah. Have a good night's sleep. Yes.
Thank
you
you.
so much, Nicole. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Patrick, if you would like to stay back a couple of minutes.
Sure.
Great. I'll stop recording.